Excellent. And does ground crew need stuff as well? Fire resistant, fireproof clothing, or is it just less important and they know where not to step?
That's a good question and one that I'm less familiar with. I would assume that folks in the fuels business and other areas where there's a significant hazard of fire have some protective gear, but I'm not aware of it, and I have not heard of that as a need. That may be a need. I just haven't heard it.
Maybe that's worthwhile looking out for, right? Because that's where race car or race car support staff
Yeah,
clothing is probably perfectly fine, right? Because if,
yeah.
if it's fine for NASCAR or Formula One, it's probably fine for flight ground crew also. Excellent. Right, we got a couple more questions
Okay.
if your time permits.
Yeah, sure.
Excellent. Let's go to another first, because I think it's a clothing clarification, and then we go to scribe after that. Another?
Yeah, so there will probably be what's called a silane treatment on those fibers, which might be part of the chemically smell, and that can wash off with time, but that will not affect anything to do with the inherent fly resistance of the meta-aramid fibers. So old
Hmm.
versus new. The one thing that aramid fibers are vulnerable to is UV radiation. So if someone just wears this out in the sunshine all the time, that might not be ideal, because that will actually cut the molecular change of the material. And the shorter the molecular change you get, the more flammable it gets.
Okay.
But just an FYI. So basically, if someone's put it in their wardrobe just for a fancy dress on a night out, great. If someone is using it working in the fields every day, probably fine. But yeah, definitely you want the people who have it as Halloween outfit versus the people who use it to, say, do yard work.
Okay. I had not heard that before.
Yeah, so anyway,
that's very interesting.
If you need someone to chime in on the
thank you.
fibers, that is literally what I do for a living, is the mechanics and degradation of fibers and composite materials. And I've got a colleague at Imperial, I'm just emailing you now. He's professor of fire science at Imperial, and there's not really any flammability standard I've come across which he doesn't know about and has someone comment on. And he and I have both been quite aggressively lobbying our university to do more to help academics from Ukraine, but I'm sure he'd love to find a way to help out if it's just providing expertise, because you'll find there'll be a test method that your guys probably that fabric for your guys has to pass, and then there'll be one over here that for our guys, and what you'll find is that if it's a Boeing safety standard or an Airbus international test method, they'll have different numbers, and you'll look at them and be like, they're identical. So if someone goes, oh, it hasn't passed the US standard, be like, yeah, but it's passed the Airbus standard, and they're the same but with different names. So I'm sure between the two of us, if you need some help, we'd be happy to jump in.
It's interesting, and I know the Ukrainians, they know this is an issue, and particularly on the Army aviation side, the helicopter guys. So if anybody knows, there's a charity that's been run since 2014 inside Ukraine. It's Come Back Alive. They just raised a bunch of money to go down the path to get some of this kit for the Army, and I assume also for the Air Force. But it's going to take some time. But I've sniffed around on that topic. I know that they're looking at this, and hopefully either buy stuff from somewhere or buy the material and make it themselves, which in Ukraine that would to be able to create suits shouldn't be a problem at all. So I think I will send you that just so you have it, because it may be of interest to you as the Ukrainians go down that path with making their own stuff or buying.
Yeah, sure. If there's something I can do with whatever tests I have, I'll happy to help. And we have a lot of flammability testing equipment in house, and Imperial College, where I also lecture, also has stuff. And there's some motivated people who would like to use their special, unique, weird skill sets if we can.
Yeah, and I'll tell you this too. One thing I've noticed, and you probably noticed too, is that when I started going down this path, I realized just how much stuff out there looks legitimate that is not. And you have to be very careful with what you buy and what you give, because you could, I guess, be deceived. There's a lot of things that look like genuine flight gear that are actually not. So if folks in Ukraine are looking to find their own solution, like I said, I'll send you it, maybe to help make sure that they don't go down a wrong path.
Yeah, it sounds really, really fantastic, right? Really useful. Another quick question, Professor. You referenced that Professor Guillermo Rein.
Yeah, so I've just sent the details over. So yeah, Guillermo's a colleague of mine. So I'm the polymer and composites expert, so I understand why things degrade, and then he's our guy who understands fire, which is just horrendously complicated from the physics perspective. But yeah, he cut his teeth developing the software to model fire in space for NASA. So I would have thought he also probably did some of the requirements for what we call Langley research criteria for flammability of various things. And you'll probably find Langley research criteria is probably based off of a Boeing safety standard or vice versa, and they've just got different numbers that are all the exact same thing. It's just, there's so many damn standards in anything to do with military or aerospace, and a lot of them are just equivalent. It's just knowing which ones are, and then getting someone to do a test and doing some paperwork to say it's the same thing.
Cool. That's really interesting. I didn't know. I did a little research on the materials, but until I heard you speaking, I had no idea that there were folks out there that had that level of knowledge. So I think you could be helpful.
This is part of the beauty of the space. You will often, about 40% of the time, you'll find someone who knows way too much about whatever is being brought up, which is always good. And yeah, I've been following Professor Rain because he's had a very clear views on the Russian invasion of Ukraine for a long time as well as some commentary early on in the war about the consequences to cities. But let's put that aside. Let's go to Scribe. Please, Scribe.
So I have a question for Mantis. Are you having to travel back and forth from, I'm guessing you're from the United States to Ukraine at the moment?
Yeah, so kind of my personal stories. When I retired, my wife and I, we had been planning for years to take a break and just travel and not make any major life decisions and travel around for a year, 15 months. But when this thing happened in February, and I knew I was going to have this time off, I think, let me just say that I'm sure that a bunch of folks listening on this channel right now are probably just like me. You care and you want to see solutions, and there's ways you can help, and there's oftentimes ways it's frustrating because you can't help enough. In my case, because I had had this experience and I had been in Ukraine so much and understand how to help, who to contact, I'm able to communicate. There's no way I could just vacation for a year without helping. So to get to your question, I come here, I'm in Krakow right now. I come here, I'm not here full time. I come here, I work with Operation White Stork. And then if I'm not here, and then I go back and forth to Ukraine to do deliveries. When I'm not here, I help remotely, talking to the Ukrainian Air Force, talking to other folks about what they need. Then I go do research. I start branching out to see how I can help, ordering stuff or getting donations, and then getting it over here somehow. Frankly, the easiest way is I go back to the U.S. I have a bunch of stuff collected at my house, and I get in a bunch of duffel bags and I bring it over here. That's just the easiest way I've found to do it. And then from Krakow into Ukraine, that's I mean, it's kind of the easy part, right? For me, I get you get documents and you go through customs, and you just go to Ukraine. I don't go near the front lines. I'm not, I wouldn't be useful up there. I go to I've been to Kyiv, I was in Cherkasy recently, I've been to Odessa, stuff like that. So I'm not in the trenches or anything like that, but I pop over and meet the Air Force guys at different spots and deliver straight to them.
Well, if you ever need cheaper options or any options in general for booking airfare and hotels, I am a travel agent and I'm willing to give my services to you to help you and everyone else out and have better options to be able to stretch your dollar more to help out Ukraine, essentially.
Thank you, because I will tell you that for a guy like me who's just started this project, my biggest cost is the airfare, but then excess bags.
Yep.
And I've been throwing money at that, just my personal money, because my focus has been to get the gear from people I know at this first stage. So I'm happy just to get the gear in my hands, and I don't mind, buying duffel bags and paying a bunch of excess bag fees, because in the scheme of things, to get it to these guys, it's peanuts considering what they face.
Well, if you want, I can easily help you find better tickets and potentially work with the airlines themselves to maybe knock down the cost of your tickets. That way it isn't costing you an arm and a leg just to get across the puddle.
Oh, thank you very much. I will definitely take you up on that offer, especially after this last trip I just came over. I had
Yeah,
like five.
I
I had like five duffel bags. I mean, I got down to. I knew how many flight suits and jackets I could get in one duffel to hit like 49.9 pounds. So I squeezed every little ounce into these excess bags as possible.
yeah, and look, those duffel bags aren't cheap either. I know the prices of them, and they
Yeah.
so yeah, I'm willing to help you out on that front.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. Let's get your stuff.
If you want, if you can, I can try to send you a DM, or you can send me a DM, so that way we can take this off Maria.
Got it. I just sent you. I sent you something right now.
Will do. Thank you.
And
Thank
if I recall correctly, there's a couple of airlines that actually don't charge for excess baggage if it's stuff for Ukraine. I'll ping a friend and ask the details about that. In the meantime, I see we got Latin back. Latin?
Oh, hey, Doman, thanks. Yeah, I had to do something, and nice to see you still here. Mantis, right? Mantis is
Yes.
the call sign. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, another question that I've been thinking about. We talk a lot about Western aircraft for obvious reasons on this space, but since about, I don't know, it must have been one of the Ramstein meetings where I decided, okay, whatever happens there happens. In the meantime, it looks like this critical phase, counteroffensive stage that Ukraine is moving into now they're gonna go to war with they're gonna carry out those offensive operations with the aircraft they have, clearly, unless there's some surprise. And I'm interested in what you think as they begin to conduct counteroffensive operations with the existing air defense aircraft that they have, right? So MiG-29, Su-27.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in your assessment of what they'll be able to do with that, and parallel to that, the other aircraft that I've looked at real closely that I have a feeling there may be an important role for it in that phase of the war is the Su-24, and specifically, I'm thinking of all the aircraft they have. If anything's going to be a potentially, I think it's one of the platforms they have that may be suitable for JDAM, if technically there's a way to do it, which we're assuming maybe that's being worked on, because JDAMs have been announced, but without a platform for it. So I'm interested in your thoughts on both those things.
Yeah. If you if you look at the top of my 24-hour-old Twitter page, those are actually Su-24 guys. They're standing in front of a Su-24. Yeah, I agree, because in some ways, if you look at, I mean, just basics, right? I mean, Su-24 is not an air-to-air fighter. Of course, it had some air-to-air IR missiles for self-defense, but I mean, it is a air-to-ground focused aircraft. And I want to say, am I wrong? But I think they also participated in strikes on Snake Island a long time ago, and they've been active. I think you can see videos and stuff of the Su-24s. Su-24 just has to be the aircraft that can carry the most air-to-ground munitions. I can't imagine. I know MiG-29 couldn't, and I doubt a Su-27 could. It's got to be able to carry the most air-to-ground munitions. So I would imagine that they would be looking at that platform, just because the sheer weight it can carry, and also it probably doesn't hurt that it's a two-seat aircraft, that you can have somebody that can focus on the munition, and then another guy to focus on the pilot, on the flying. So that does make sense, just from a pure kind of air power standpoint of like, hey, how would you do this? It makes sense. Now, all the other stuff that goes into, and I'm completely unaware, and I don't know how all that stuff works, but adapting of these aircraft to fire and to employ Western munitions, clearly the MiG-29, just because there's a longer history of it, and there's MiG-29s in NATO countries, to come up with solutions to adapt that's just probably easier. So maybe my guess is maybe that's some of the decision making. You may have an aircraft that may be better suited in terms of how many weapons it can carry, like you make the point of the Su-24. But then you may maybe the situation is it's not the best solution, but it's the one that's most easy to implement, which is MiG-29s or Su-27s. What the actual reality is, I don't know, but that would be my guess about how that would go down.
In the air-to-air role, as they at some point decide to push forward. Again, I understand there may be things you're not able to share with us for understandable reasons, but the 29s and the Su-27s, as they what they currently have in that role, and given that range deficiency that they have compared to the some of the more advanced Russian types, what do you think that how would you expect that they might try to use those, or would they just try to sit them back and not really participate and not push forward, knowing that they might lose a lot of them?
Yeah, the MiG-29s I think make a little bit more sense if you're kind of taking that thought process forward, because they have more of them. They're also have been modified to shoot harms, so they're kind of already up there doing stuff and firing at air defenses. So I mean, totally. Once again, and I know nothing. I'm totally retired Joe, but just looking at the numbers of aircraft and some of what's been done already, like if they are going to push one forward, it seems more likely, kind of MiG-29s. But when you talk about pushing forward too, like there's kind of two things, right? I mean, the air-to-air to tangle or distract or whatever you want to do with the air-to-air threat's one thing. That's really hard to do from low altitude. So I think that they're probably going to focus on the air to ground game, try to preserve their forces, and try to employ whatever munitions that they're equipped with. But it's hard for me to imagine the air to air stuff at this stage.
And am I correct in that maybe part of the reason that I agree with you on that probably because if they're not able to, with the existing equipment, really narrow that gap that we hear Ukrainian pilots talking about, then maybe the best way to use those assets would be, well, both of them, the 29 and the 27, have at least some of them have been operating with the harm, and maybe that would probably maybe be the more the way that they could open up some airspace for other assets, right?
Yeah, and I think I read that the harm is a great munition. Um, uh, Certainly great for temporary suppression. Obviously, you're not going to get a hard kill on an air defense system, but it's trying to think how to say this. I'm sure there's limitations with how it's employed. I'm sure it's effective in some regards and in some senses, but others it's not like it would be if we were employing the harm with how we conduct the seed mission. And then also too, you'd have to have a lot, I think, to have a real solid kind of air campaign with the fighters that they have right now to go in there and open up corridors and stuff like that. That's just once again total guess. I don't follow it super close, but I think the best thing is to give them things that keep their fighters away from the air threat and away from the ground threat that can make a difference, and harms make a difference, and JDAMs make a difference, and those are things that you can employ and preserve your force.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mantis. And we have one last question from Abdallah, who's from the UAE, who are in all the news now about those Mirages maybe going to eventually Ukraine. Abdallah?
Hi, Doman. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mantis, for your time. Just wanted to ask you a quick question. About a month or so ago, we saw Russian pilots with Western gear. As you know, the equipment they get from the Chinese are just that, Chinese equipment. How can we prevent? I don't know if you have information. How can we prevent the Russians getting their hands on Western gear for their pilots? Thank you so much.
Yeah, do you remember? I didn't see that, but what was the gear specifically? Was it flight suits and stuff like that? I did see something where they had a picture of a Russian pilot in a flight suit that was totally burned and clearly wasn't made of any kind of fire resistant material.
Yeah, I'll send you the article. Yeah, it was the whole thing, just the whole the suit, the helmet, the gloves. Yeah, so they were able to acquire those equipment. I think the article said it's through Britain, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, my guess is I think if you go look at the current for the U.S. Air Force, the current manufacturer I think is Carter Industries. I'll just give you an example. And if you go to their webpage, they have a very specific note about international purchases. And I remember looking at it and go, okay, this is pretty wide open. It was like there's only a few countries, Cuba, North Korea, that were specifically limited. I'm sure Russia's on that list now. But my point that I'm getting at is, at least as I understand it, I could be wrong, that the ability to sell these type of things like flight suits and stuff of that type of fire resistant material internationally is there's not a whole lot of issues with it. It's not an ITAR issue, so I can see how it would not be difficult maybe to get some of that stuff internationally.
All right, thank you very much. Nadia, Alex, did you have something to add?
Yeah, so I would say it's the Chinese also make meta-aramid fibers. And actually, in some of the testing I've done for some products, the meta-aramid fibers out of China are actually better than out of Japan or the USA. So it's pretty hard because that material is used in safety critical applications like for firemen and various other things all around the world. So preventing access to that textile strikes me as impossible, especially as the Chinese make so much of it, and actually it's really, really good stuff in the testing that we've done. So unfortunately, I think that's going to be a hard one to shut down.
Thank you. What a bummer. Thanks a lot.
Mantis, thank you so much. We took much more of your time than was planned, but I hope you didn't mind too much. Got you up to 222, which for a 22-hour-old account is pretty good. And I hope that you got some connections made and some extra input into all the great stuff you're doing, getting that equipment to Ukrainian aviators.
No, thank you very much for having me. What's funny is I tell folks, and I think some folks that are out there listening right now who have been in the military, like the military is kind of like a comfortable straitjacket, right? And I wore that comfortable straitjacket for 25 years, and I just took it off a few months ago. So doing something like this isn't necessarily in my nature, but talking with fish, it is necessary for me to kind of crawl out of my shell because for me to help Ukraine, I need to get the word out. So I appreciate everybody here listening today, and hopefully got something out of my project. And I appreciate all the leads and the help, and I'm glad that I think this will be good to help take me forward and help Ukraine more.
And thank you so much for staying with us, even though Fish abandoned you so cruelly only half an hour in. Hope it wasn't too traumatizing an experience.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks again for everything. I really enjoyed it.
Likewise. Thank you very much for joining us. In about 8 minutes, we will transition to our next segment planned for today, which will be Biljana's Battlefield, installment number 2, today featuring Samuel Bendit as well. And they'll be taking us into the world of, I think, Russian weapons development, uncrewed, unmanned aerial, and possibly other vehicles. Let's see what all is in store for that. In the meantime, during the 7 minutes, I think, Mockers, do we have a bit of a news of the day review?
I can maybe tell you a little bit of a news of the day review. bear with me 1 second while I pull up my latest bookmarks. Oh no, I can't. I've lost it. No, I can't. However, I am going to run off and leave you very shortly. So I just wanted to say thank you everybody for listening today, and I will track down my updates and send it you, Doman.
No, that's quite all right. I just thought that's what you had in mind. I'll bring up a couple of important things that I think will fly under the radar. One of them being that despite the governmental confusion, and this is, I'm not just saying this because we have Biljana with us, but despite the confusion and what's going on in the government, Bulgaria is still sending large quantities of shells and other weaponry, and will continue to do so, apparently, through third parties, etc., which is of great support to Ukraine. And I just want to commend I just want to commend the correct decision making being done there, even when the president and the caretaker government leave a little something to be desired. Biljana, good morning. How are you doing?
Good morning, Doman, and thank you for this kind comment and this great introduction into Bulgarian politics. I'm doing well. How are you, and how is everyone?
I'm well. We're looking forward to starting, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have in store for us today, Biljana.
Thank you. Yes, today we have Sam Bendit, who is one of the utmost experts on autonomous, uncrewed, and robotic military systems, and I'm really excited to be interviewing him. But we can also wait. I think we're supposed to start at 10. We could wait a few more minutes, Doman, if you prefer, so others can join us. We can also start now. What's your preference?
If you're up for it, we can start with a gentle introduction, then slowly roll in forward.
Awesome. Well, I'm happy to do that. Sam, how about you?
I am online. How do you hear me?
We hear you. We hear you loud and clear.
Excellent, excellent. Well, let's give maybe a few minutes for people to join, those who plan to be here at 10/1/ wherever they are around the world, and then maybe we can start promptly in about 5 minutes. Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
Totally fine with me.
In which case, if that's all right by you, I'll take the opportunity and ask Biljana a question completely unrelated to this in the meantime. So the election's coming up in Bulgaria, which you might know a little bit about, not necessarily the election, but Bulgaria. I hear that you've visited once or twice, right? And the election's coming up on Sunday. Were you just as surprised as I was reading that, it doesn't really matter what happens, there's still going to be a high baseline of munitions, other equipment being delivered from Bulgaria? And of course, I think that shows that Commissioner Thierry Breton's visit, he's the Commissioner for Industry in the European Union, visit to Bulgaria a couple of weeks ago definitely didn't go in vain.
Domin, it's a great question. I hope that's the case, but I will believe it when I see it. And by that I mean, let's see how the election goes, who gets elected, whether it's free and fair. Let's monitor and see whether there will be protests. Once we have a government, because we also have a history of having elections and then dragging on for weeks and months because the electorate hasn't decided clearly, or a group is disputing the elections. We've had many issues with that. So let's see how the election goes, and then see whether that policy continues or not.
Of course, after the most recent election, there hasn't been a government, right? So the country's stuck with the caretaker government since the last election in, what was it, September, October, something like that. The election before that led to a government that governed with full authority for maybe 5 months, and then with a caretaker status for the rest of the few months until the election. The election before that didn't lead to a government, not really. The one before that, not either. Hopefully, what is this, 5th time lucky?
fifth time since we're monitoring. There have been more before that, but yes, you're exactly right. The inability to elect a government that actually stays in power and can support the continuation of this policy, for me, is something that we have to monitor, and that's why I think we have to first monitor the election, see how the election goes, and then I'm going to trust those statements, but not yet. So I'm skeptical.
I think a little bit of skepticism is very healthy, especially in a situation like this. But I have to say, I was particularly heartened when the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty little feature came out a few days ago, showing just how vast the quantity of especially munitions, but also other equipment actually ended up making its way from Bulgaria to Ukraine. Through various means, methods, paths, and ways, and just how much of that, how inventive they were, but how dangerous that was perceived to be by the Russians, and how willing they were to, just like they were in 2015, 2016, 2017, to use their intelligence services to blow up ammo depots and try poisonings again.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up a really good point. For years, Bulgarian arms exports and arms sales have been focusing on markets, or have diversified with markets that are traditionally Russian markets. And Ukraine is one of them. So that is also a policy that we have introduced for years. And now it's obviously a lot more sensitive and a lot more problematic to work with those markets, but because of that continuation, there is a chance that we actually stick to our word and continue with the exports. And a few years ago, yes, there were threats against a Bulgarian arms dealer who, to this day, I don't think there's a clear conclusion as to why he was the Russians tried to poison him twice, and to this day I don't think there is a clear understanding of why that happened, but there are a few solid hypotheses, and one of them is that he was on Russia's radar, and they wanted to eliminate him because he had been exporting weapons, small arms and light weapons and ammunition, to Syria as well as Ukraine. So that's an interesting development also to monitor. And also for years, Bulgaria has been we are a NATO and an EU member, and we have very, very strong communist legacies and a lot of pro-Russian sentiments in the country at key positions, decision-making positions in the intelligence service and so on. But we have shown in our foreign policy, in our military, foreign policy strategy, and in our doctrine that we are trying to side more with the West, and the export of ammunition to Ukraine is a demonstration of that.
Thank you, Biljana. And on that, I think we've reached the top of the hour.
Absolutely. Sam, are you ready?
Indeed, I am.
Awesome. So, hello everyone and welcome. And Sam, thanks so much for agreeing to be my first guest on Biljana's Battlefield Hour. This is a new segment that Domen has been asking me to start this podcast for months. Don't laugh, it's because of you that I'm here. So thank you, Domen, for your persistence. And I really wanted to interview Sam first, because for those who don't know, Sam is one of the utmost experts on Russia's autonomous, uncrewed, and robotic military systems. And what's more interesting and important, I think, is that Sam has been building his expertise before Russia invaded Ukraine in February of last year. He has years of experience, and he's been a Russia watcher for probably decades by this point. And I think I and everyone else that's listening to us today and will listen to us when the podcast is uploaded on various platforms can learn from his expertise and his knowledge. So regarding the format of this discussion, I have prepared a few questions for Sam, and we'll talk for about 15 to 30 minutes, and then I will take questions from the audience. So everyone prepare your questions. We have Sam for an hour here, so now is your chance to ask anything you want about Russia's technological developments and their application in Ukraine. So Sam, welcome. And can we start by asking you, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and how did you become an expert on such cool topics?
Thank you, Biljana, and thank you, Daman, for hosting us. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and to everyone who is listening in right now. As you have said, I have indeed followed Russian military developments for many, many years. I would say probably in earnest since around 2006, 2007. I was always fascinated by the emergent technology, by the new tech. Prior to my current employment, which I'll get to in a second, I was a civilian employee at the National Defense University where I worked on a project that looked at the emergence of new technologies for disaster response. And so around 2009 through 2014 is when I was introduced to the civilian quadcopters, civilian drones used as reconnaissance and basically intel gathering assets after disasters. I was part of field experimentations that took place at Camp Roberts military base in California, which actually tested a lot of these civilian technologies and introduced the military to how rapidly civilians can scale up applications and use various IT and technology skills for greatest effect. I mean, if that sounds familiar, that's basically what really got me hooked. And currently, I am a member of a Russia Studies program at Center for Naval Analyses. I am part of a team that looks at the development of Russian military technologies and systems. We analyze how Russia develops weapons, how it's using them, what is the military policy for its applications. We looked at the Russian deployments domestically in the former Soviet space and internationally. And of course, now we have a laser focus on what the Russian military is doing in Ukraine. I'm also an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security, where I am a member of their technology national security program. And I am there basically also to provide support and analysis on the emergent and new technologies that is coming from Russia. At the CNA, Russia Studies program, I am looking at the development of military autonomy, robotics, uncrewed systems, and development of military artificial intelligence. I really started looking at it since around 2016, 2017, when Russian news outlets started basically releasing stories about Russian developments of unmanned aerial vehicles, of unmanned ground vehicles, of their maritime developments. I followed it all the way through the beginning of Russian invasion. And of course, now I am trying to basically stay on top of the news cycle related to those issues on a daily basis. I am on Twitter, of course. We are on Twitter Spaces, and I try to post my research on Twitter as well for people to basically to take in and analyze for themselves. I am a native Russian speaker. I was born in the former Soviet Union. I was actually born in Moscow. My family came to the United States in 1989. And so I've always maintained a personal connection to the former Soviet space. This conflict is very personal to me, as it is for many people from that part of the world. And I look forward to discussing a lot of topics and issues in the next hour.
Sam, thank you. That's you have a fascinating background, and thank you for sharing all of this with us. With regards to how Russia's technologies have evolved and Russia's technology policy has evolved over the past year since Russia invaded Ukraine, what can you tell us?
Well, what's interesting about this, and a lot has been already said about Russian policies and their conduct and their military operations, basically in the opening days and weeks and even months of the war. So I won't belabor that. What's interesting about this, from a purely objective standpoint, is that Russian military has practiced different concepts and tactics prior to the invasion. There were a lot of drills and exercises in Russia proper. A lot of new concepts, a lot of new developments were tested out elsewhere. But Russian military was basically preparing for a large-scale defensive action against NATO, against a high-tech adversary, as they've always indicated NATO is in their analytical papers and content. Russia really wasn't ready for this large-scale offensive operation. And so a lot of their preparations, a lot of their concepts really were scrambled, not just by a completely different type of war they're waging, but also by massive mistakes made at the highest levels that really prevented Russian military from actually being prepared for this type of war. And so Russian military in many ways has been playing catch up to a lot more agile and inventive Ukrainian defenders and Ukrainian forces. Russian military technology policy in that respect was basically trying to utilize Russian military advantages, or so they seemed, in precision-guided missiles, in regular missiles, in aircraft, and in other advanced weaponry, in trying to basically pacify Ukrainian defenses. And that has not happened. And that is probably one of the biggest lessons from this war, in that even advanced militaries don't always get their way when it comes to a large-scale offensive operations against a well-prepared and a well-determined defending force. I think when it comes to the application of more advanced systems, such as UAVs, such as unmanned ground vehicles, or even maritime systems, again, Russia had concepts and tactics that they practiced, that they even applied in Syria. But a lot of those lessons could not be really replicated very well against a well-equipped and knowledgeable defending force, which basically negated a lot of Russian advantages in UAVs or any other systems that Russians thought they had. For example, in Syria, Russia was operating in a very permissive environment, meaning the forces they were targeting with their UAVs or with other systems really could not counter Russians in kind. Syrian forces really didn't have a lot of air defense systems, electronic warfare systems, or any other advanced tactics that could negate Russian advantages. But Ukraine is not Syria. Ukraine is a very different case. And so for years, Ukraine has been preparing and drilling and practicing for this war. Russia apparently was also preparing for a war, but it's not exactly clear if the result is basically what they really contemplated or what they actually considered.
Sam, thank you for this overview. This is really interesting. So, are there any lessons that Russia learned from its involvement in Syria that it could apply to Ukraine?
One of the best lessons learned in Syria, not just by Russians, but also Ukrainians who no doubt watched and observed what Russia was and wasn't doing, is the evolution of the reconnaissance fire and reconnaissance strike complex. Basically, it comprises of land-based, ground-based rather, artillery, long-range artillery rocket systems, targeting the adversary with the help of UAVs, where UAVs are basically eyes and ears in the air, and they guide these ground-based assets to targets. They monitor the targets in real time, and they provide the most up-to-date information about adversarial movements and locations so that these ground-based assets can strike. Ukrainians actually really learn this very well. And I would say when it comes to this reconnaissance fire, reconnaissance strike contour, if we put Ukrainians and Russians side by side, Ukrainians were the ones who were more flexible and faster in really implementing this practice against the invading Russian forces. What the Russian military didn't have in the opening weeks of the war was a large-scale UAV presence. By the time Russian military put a lot of their UAVs in the air, they were lost in large numbers to Ukrainian countermeasures, to Ukrainian air defenses, to Ukrainian electronic warfare, as well as to Russian pilot errors. But I think reconnaissance fire, reconnaissance strike contour is now sort of the go-to tactic used by both sides in trying to target each other's forces with the help of not just military-grade UAVs, but also plenty of commercial quadcopters like the Chinese-made DJI, because a lot of these strikes are conducted at short ranges and medium ranges and even at long ranges. But we'll get to a couple of other aspects of UAV use, I guess, in a little while, because in Syria, Russia learned that having plenty of loitering munitions is absolutely essential. Having plenty of so-called kamikaze one-way combat strike drones is absolutely necessary. And having long-range ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance drones, as well as long-range combat drones, is absolutely essential in any military campaign. And these lessons weren't just learned from its use in Syria, but also by watching what Azerbaijan has done against the Armenian military in the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war.
Thanks, Sam, for this very comprehensive answer. So with regards to UAVs and also other technologies that Russia has been deploying in Ukraine, how do you see any changes over the past year in Russia's tech ecosystem since the start of the war? Any trends that you would like to highlight for us?
Oh, absolutely. So Russia went into this war with a relatively large military UAV fleet. Russia boasted of having about 2,000 UAV units total, encompassing short, medium, and some of their longer range UAVs. The vast majority of those drones were intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. They weren't military, they weren't built for dropping bombs. Russia had very few actual combat and actual long range reconnaissance drones. Some of them were lost initially. Russia still doesn't have a lot of these in action. And one of the lessons from Syria and Nagorno-Karabakh was any modern military conflict involves a mix of different types of UAVs working together to provide a common operating picture. And so Russian military still uses plenty of its ISR drones. Russian military is using more of its domestically manufactured loitering munitions, like the Lancet and the Kub drones with a range of about 40 kilometers. And in order to plug the capability gap in its basically lack of long-range combat and ISR drones, Russia turned to Iran. And that partnership has been very well documented. And Russia is using Iranian-provided Shahed 136, 131 drones as one-way, basically, artillery shells against stationary Ukrainian targets in order to cause as much damage as possible to civilian infrastructure, such as Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Russia claims to be developing its combat drones, which are the equivalents of Turkey-provided Bayraktar drones and other military systems. But again, it was able to turn to its ally, like Iran, to plug a key capability gap. But probably one of the most important evolutions in this war over the past 12 months is the mass-scale application of commercial drones. Chinese-made DJI drones, multiple models made by DJI, the Mavic, the Matrix, the M30, and others. And now the absolutely explosive, no pun intended, emergence of FPV racing drones as one-way kamikaze drones, which are capable of destroying tanks, artillery, and striking Russian positions. The emergence of and the application of numerous civilian drones was a bottom-up approach. In other words, Russian military has plenty of concepts and tactics and official directives for fielding and using its military drones, like the Orlan 10, the Aileron 3, the Zala models, the Granat models, and many others. But the commercial drone application was kind of a bottom-up approach by soldiers themselves. These drones were supplied by volunteers on money raised from all over Russia and some from abroad. Russians are basically now using Telegram as a marketplace for raising funds for different technologies that Russian military lacks at the front. And at the top of every list, at the top of every volunteer provided call for money to help Russian soldiers is a commercial quadcopter, like DJI and like many other models. And so today it's nearly impossible to imagine conflict in Ukraine without videos from these commercial quadcopters or without use of these commercial quadcopters as tactical elements that can range at no more than 5 to 10 kilometers, but provide absolutely essential applications for the Russian military in terms of conducting intelligence, reconnaissance, in terms of dropping bombs, and performing many, many other functions. And the same could be said for Ukraine as well. In fact, Ukraine led the way in using a lot of commercial drones. And a lot of Russian commentary about the war really starts with the fact that Ukrainians are first to do so, or Ukrainians are more successful in doing so, and that Russian military needs more commercial quadcopters and FPV drones as expendable assets in this war.
Interesting. So basically, coverage of how Ukraine or different Ukrainian forces are using UAVs is stimulating the Russians to
Absolutely.
supply more of them.
Absolutely. And again, you can go to any, yeah, you can go to any Russian language Telegram channel which writes or covers this war, and there would be discussions about Ukrainian tactics and Ukrainian successes in using different types of technologies, both military and civilian, in this conflict.
With regards to Sam, you mentioned domestic production of Russian drones and other technologies. How much of the UAVs you're talking about have been produced within Russia, and how many of them have been imported from other countries? Can you give us any rough estimate?
Well, that's a great question. I think actual precise numbers about how many UAVs were manufactured in Russia were probably available before Russian invasion. Now, for all reasons, and obviously for operational security, Russian media and Russian military doesn't really talk about the numbers. What is absolutely clear is that a lot of Russian commentary, both state commentary as well as Russian military blogger or volunteer commentary, points to the need for large numbers for all types of drones, especially for reconnaissance drones, especially for kamikaze drones like the Lancet, and especially for these completely expendable, cheap commercial quadcopters or FPV drones. We are seeing basically more and more reports from Russian state media that the defense industrial sector is actually meeting the demand. They are supposedly going to manufacture large numbers of these military drones. But the real numbers are actually coming from the civilian sector, with lots of Russian regions, regional governments, volunteer efforts actually talking how they are opening up drone training centers and drone manufacturing centers to assemble these commercial drones by the hundreds each month. So lots of these institutions and lots of these efforts are talking about assembling maybe 1, 2, or 300 of these UAVs, of these drones for the war. Now multiply that by dozens of efforts across the country, and you're actually talking about a sizable number. But such drones don't have a long shelf life in Ukraine. In fact, both Russians and Ukrainians basically give their commercial drones a few days, up maybe a few weeks maximum of a shelf life. And so they view this as completely throwaway, expendable tech that must be supplemented in large numbers. I think one of the numbers recently cited by Ukrainians was that they may lose up to 10 or 15 of these drones daily, meaning hundreds are probably flying, so that they are losing a significant percentage of their drones on a regular basis. The same probably can be said about Russians. And as Russian defense industry is indicating, they're going to meet this demand that they're going to manufacture a lot of these drones, both military and civilian type, both aircraft type and quadcopter type UAVs. I think as the volunteers are, and as the Russian military itself is covering the lack of a proper response from the state, more and more civilians are actually stepping up. And so a lot of people are just assembling these, for example, quadcopters or FPVs, literally in their garage or in their apartment or in their home. The biggest difference between these commercial technologies is that drones like FPV could cost just a few $100s to build and assemble. DJI Mavic drones can cost just a few $1,000s, maybe $10,000, $15,000 max. In contrast to military grade drones, which can cost many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars each.
Sam, this is really interesting, and you've been following Russia's military industry and policies and developments for years, and you know probably better than I do about the endemic corruption and the inefficiencies in that industry. But then you mentioned that the media sites reports that the industry is meeting the demand at the moment, and drone manufacturing and training is increasing, and so on. Do you find these narratives plausible?
I think some of them are plausible. I mentioned Telegram as an outlet for lots of detailed information about this war, and Russian language, pro-Kremlin, pro-war Telegram channels, some of which have millions of subscribers, have been very vocal about the problems in the Russian defense industry and the Russian defense industry's inability to deliver needed technologies in enough numbers for the Russian soldiers, such as very cheap commercial quadcopters. I'll give you an example. When Russia started fielding Iranian Shahed drones last fall, some of these Telegram channels were extremely vocal in their critique of the domestic industry, asking how is it that Iranians, who have been under sanctions for decades, were able to build this cheap drone basically over their knee from shit and sticks, which is the exact phrase, while companies like Rostec or other defense enterprises have so many billions of dollars worth of projects and were not able to deliver similar products in large enough numbers. And so this is one example where Russian Telegram-based media, as opposed to the state media, is actually pointing out to a significant issues within the defense sector. And the same Telegram channels talked a lot about the corruption and other issues that may have prevented these enterprises from fielding necessary technology for the war. What's interesting also about this is that some of these Telegram channels, some of the commentators are trying to excuse Russian government's action by saying, well, nobody was really ready for this type of conflict, and nobody was really ready for the DJI effect or for mass scale use of commercial technologies in the war in place of bullets and artillery shells. And that Russia, like many other countries, were actually building military grade drones, which take a lot more to develop, a lot longer to test, and are way more expensive. But again, none of that is really an excuse for the lack of even cheap commercial type tactical ISR drones for the Russian forces. Around the Battle of Kharkiv last year, a lot of Russian soldiers were quite vocal on social media. They were saying that they are blind as kittens at the front because they lack these short-range commercial type ISR drones to give them an overview of what is happening just a few miles away. And that sort of ISR gap in the Russian forces may have contributed to Ukrainian breakthrough success around Kharkiv. But these issues are going to persist and they're going to remain, especially as the defense industry is trying to turn around and launch completely new production of smaller, cheaper, and much more scalable products, as opposed to fewer and more expensive UAVs.
And this, thank you, Sam. This basically, you almost answered my next question when it comes to what's the future usage of drones in the war in Ukraine. Are you seeing smaller, more expendable, cheaper drones being produced en masse and deployed there?
Absolutely. For the foreseeable future, while this war rages, or the next sort of evolution of this war is going to take place, or whatever other conflict Russia or other countries will be involved in, the basically common conclusion is that these type of commercial technologies are going to have a very central place at the tactical level for any military force. And what we're seeing now is really kind of the change of narrative from saying that a DJI commercial Mavic drone is the face of new warfare, to now the FPV racing drones as not only the pacing threat, but as the most important technology in this conflict. A lot of commentators in Russia are talking about how the next war, or that in the near future, any military force should be saturated with these quadcopter / FPV type of drones at the very tactical level. How each squad, each platoon, each company is supposed to have a lot of these type of drones, plus a number of ISR longer range drones, and how all of these drones are supposed to basically feed all the data into a common operational picture. And so a lot of Russian commentators are envisioning more and more FPV type of racing combat kamikaze drones alongside of military drones that fly at higher altitude and deliver a significant munitions package against the adversary. But these are basically conversations which are influenced by this stage of the war. We don't know how the war is going to progress, how long it's going to take place, and what other technologies are going to come to the fore, such as how are all of these small commercial type FPV type drones are going to be connected in a swarm, in an intelligent swarm guided by AI, which can overwhelm adversarial air defenses, electronic warfare defenses, or any other type of defenses, and basically make any ground movement or any stationary movement extremely dangerous for the forces fighting in the war.
So how can Ukraine defend itself from these different types of drones?
Well, Ukraine is already doing all the right things right now. Ukraine is developing an echelon type of defense where it combines early warning radars with different types of air defense technologies, from sort of more sophisticated to less sophisticated, to electronic warfare technologies, to observational and reconnaissance capabilities where people are watching the skies. For example, the majority of Russia-launched Shahed drones, which are targeting Ukraine, are getting shut down. It is that one or two that actually sneak past that can cause most of the damage. And Ukrainians are drilling and practicing on a daily basis how to defend themselves against the Russian drones. Another tactic that Ukraine is very concerned about, obviously, is targeting the drone operators. In fact, both sides are basically saying that targeting each other's operators is at the top of their agenda. Basically, targeting a drone launching site left of launch. In other words, targeting it before it launches, or trying to go after the operators so that there are fewer and fewer experienced people who can pilot these drones. Of course, electronic warfare plays a very important role here, and more advanced electronic warfare systems can actually play a very important part. But this threat is evolving, and the threat today may be different than the threat that was encountered by the Ukrainian forces and defenders last year. And it's not always known what kind of threat will be encountered, for example, next year. But what Ukraine is doing is that it's been flexible. It is connecting the government with end users, with soldiers, with technology developers to create a network which feeds information back and forth and utilizes the latest news and information and data to perfect, to improve, and to build new technologies for this war. The same type of network is present in part on the Russian side, but it is nowhere near as well developed as it is in Ukraine right now.
Thanks, Sam. You mentioned a few times earlier in our conversation that Iran and China have been assisting Russia with the drones deployment and production and so on. Can you tell us more about the contributions of different states on the commercial side and state side?
Of course. So on the state side, it's been well documented. Iranians have provided Russian military with the technology assembly kits to assemble Shahed 131 and 136 loitering munitions drone. It's got a range of several hundred kilometers. Russians are vehemently denying that they're flying anything Iranian. In fact, their government and all the public statements are all about Russia is only flying, quote unquote, Russian drones, not the Iranian drones. Never mind that these drones that are recovered or shut down by Ukrainians actually are, in fact, Iranian. On the commercial side, I think the picture is a little more murky. There were recent exposés how China officially provided Russia with some commercial grade drone technologies, but the absolute majority of DJI and other commercial technologies acquired by the Russian military, in fact, is coming from volunteers, and they're buying these commercial quadcopters or parts for them on online and physical marketplaces. And one of the go-to places for them is AliExpress, which is a Chinese equivalent of eBay. And so a lot of these volunteers in large numbers are trying to procure Chinese-made commercial drones for the war. They come from DJI, they come from Autel, they come from several other companies, but mostly DJI and Autel. And so it's basically kind of like a semi-official support in the sense that China officially stated that it's not selling DJI products in Ukraine and Russia. It does not want to contribute to the war, but you can't really stop acquisition of this purely commercial technology because not all of those quadcopters end up in the war. Some of them are actually purchased by commercial entities for peaceful purposes. The same goes for spare parts and key components for these drones. And so China is both sort of an official and unofficial supplier of a lot of key components. And when it comes to other commercial technologies, one of the most important Russian acquisition right now from China is in the form of microchips, semiconductors, and microelectronics for the larger war effort.
Sam, do you see sanctions having any effect on these flows of technology and supplies of drones and parts?
Great question. It's the one that's very hotly debated right now in Washington, D.C. and around the world. There were excellent articles written last year and this year about the effect of sanctions or the lack of the effect of sanctions on Russian government and the Russian military. One thing is clear, that the Russian government has plenty of avenues to acquire these commercial technologies through reestablished and newly established supply chains, through partners, through different networks, both legal and illicit, through third parties, through LLCs, and just about any other schema and mechanism. And for every one uncovered, probably half a dozen are still in existence. And this type of acquisition effort is constantly evolving as Russia is actually feeling the pressure from these sanctions on some of their defense industries. Other defense industries, for example, aren't as affected. The, as for example, Russia's high-tech manufacturing enterprises or other industries which are reliant on acquisition of commercial Western and basically international components. A lot of Russian efforts in developing newer technologies still depend on acquiring these commercial technologies, especially when it comes to building new types of UAVs. Even state-run articles cite things like statements from developers which talk about how the frame and everything else in the UAV is domestic, but microelectronics and other key components are "quote unquote" зарубежные or imported or basically acquired from China. So some of these sanctions are indeed having a lot of the effect, but the sanctions also have to evolve with a threat as Russia is becoming more crafty in developing new avenues for acquiring these technologies. These sanctions also have to evolve with a threat because a lot of countries, a lot of avenues for delivering these products to Russia are constantly evolving as well.
Thanks, Sam. Are there any other technologies that you think we should be paying attention to that Russia is currently using on the battlefield or is planning on using in the battlefield in the coming months?
I think it's a very good question. Russia talked about the development of its precision-guided munitions, its high-tech rockets and missiles prior to the war. It hasn't stopped discussing it. Russia talks about the development of high-tech combat UAVs, something that they've been discussing for many years, but are probably under tremendous pressure right now to field them in Ukraine. Russia is also talking about application of other high-tech systems such as artificial intelligence and machine learning in the war effort, although the use of those technologies and systems is harder to prove. But Russia considers the use of advanced technologies and basically the potential of its defense industrial sector to come through and deliver on the domestic high-tech solutions as absolutely essential in this war. And so artificial intelligence for decision making, for image recognition, for natural language processing, for control of autonomous weapon systems is and was at the top of the Russian Ministry of Defense's agenda for developing and fielding the next generation of weapons and systems. It's very difficult sometimes to prove the existence of this technology in the battlefield. Russian military stopped talking and discussing certain technologies in their media altogether. Some of those technologies are still debated in Russian military academia, but not sort of in public. And so I'll be watching for that, and I'll be watching for proof that these technologies exist and are in fact fielded by the Russian military.
Thank you, Sam. So we are obviously talking about a war here that was unilaterally started by Russia, and it has been atrocious. And most of the topics that we cover are rather negative. Is there any positive development or positive aspects in your research that you will be able to highlight to us?
I think the way that Ukrainian society has come together to mobilize and to help each other in this crisis is incredible. And the way that people help each other, how they help not just people who are affected, they also help animals that are affected. They're trying to talk about defending their nature as well as human lives is absolutely incredible. But like you said, it's very difficult to find a silver lining in the war of this type.
Thank you, Sam. And my last question to you before I give the floor to the audience, and I see several of you are already asking to speak, is can you share with us, you've worked on so many different topics. Can you share with us the research that you're most proud of? If there is a piece of research or project that you've worked on that you're most proud of, and also if there's a report you would like to share with us, we can advertise it here so our listeners can read it.
Yeah, I think the report I'm really proud of is our team effort to produce a public comprehensive review of Russian military and civilian artificial intelligence developments. And we wrote that out in 2021. It was published in May of 2021 and was the first real detailed public look at what Russia is working on in the military and the civilian sphere. And I still hope that this document can be used as a reference for all research going forward, now that Russia has been impacted by sanctions to such a significant extent, sort of as a litmus test whether or not they can actually deliver on the promises made, on the projects discussed, and on technologies developed that we're covering in the report. This was a team effort. All members of the Russia Studies program were involved in it. And I'm actually very proud of how comprehensive it is. It's 240 pages. So if you have the time, you can read it. It's public. It's on the CNA website. We will provide a link, and I can answer any questions about that report. But I think it's still a useful reference point, especially in light of the current crisis.
Fantastic, Sam. Thank you so much. I'll definitely have a look, and maybe the MriyaReport can even post a link to promote your work. All right, so these were, and I see a heart from Domen. I accept that as his endorsement. Thank you, Domen. So I will open it up to the audience now. So exit 266. I think you had your hand the longest. Domen, yes?
I can do all of that. Don't worry. I'm used to that, and I have a list of people in order. But I should take the opportunity and ask the very first audience question, Sam. Russian industry for a long time, Russian military industry for a long time, diverted a lot of the funds into, let's say, other things, villas on Lake Como, yachts, whatever else, right? We had a great example when we had Finnish General Pekka Toveri here, former head of Finnish military intelligence, who said, and an armored guy, who said that he's been looking out for these camouflage nets that Russians were advertising so heavily at various exhibitions, expos for many years, and he hasn't spotted a single one on any Russian tanks. Undoubtedly, the purchase order for that ended up in somebody's marble counter or a yacht engine or whatnot. Have you seen any changes, let's say, for the worse, for what we want, for the worse for Ukraine, but for the cleaner within Russian military industry since the start of the full-scale invasion? Is there any less corruption, misappropriation, sadly, less corruption, misappropriation going on in Russian military industry now?
I think it's a loaded question. We can take hours to discuss that. I'm pretty sure somebody is writing a report on that right now. I think the fact that a lot of the flaws in the Russian military's capabilities and technologies were so well documented on Telegram and were discussed so publicly in so many words and with so many swears really helped shed the light on a lot of the more atrocious problems in the military. And I think the military is well aware of it. First of all, they try to sort of silence these critics. They try to co-opt them. Most of them are in fact co-opted, and the outright critique of the MOD, Ministry of Defense, is very rare. But the fact that there were so many issues that were so well documented really kind of probably let the MOD know that basically they can't just operate as before. And there's evidence that they're trying to change it. There's evidence that they're listening to some of the volunteers in the military. They're trying to apply new tactics and weapons. But there's also evidence that they're still doing things as before. So it's kind of difficult to answer that question. I think there's plenty of a generational challenge and a generational shift within the Russian military, with younger officers more more tech-savvy officers wanting to kind of implement a lot of these breakthrough civilian technologies, and the older cadres resistant to this type of change because they perceive it as a loss of influence. There are other issues, obviously. Anytime a big military budget is involved in weapons and systems development, there are going to be delays, there are going to be quote unquote issues. And Russia is a poster child for those quote unquote issues and delays. But right now, the cost is in human lives. And with so much attention on the MOD, I wouldn't necessarily discount them trying to change some of their practices.
All right. Thank you, Sam. I'm sad to hear that, obviously, that they might be changing, but hoping for as much waste and misappropriation on their side as possible. Let's go to Latin. Then we have exit, jingo, and so on. Latin, please.
Thanks, Domin. Excellent discussion, Samuel. I've heard you before in other spaces. Always fascinating to listen to what you have to say. My question is about aircraft production in particular. And it really is kind of a one company show right now, Sukhoi. And late last year, I saw some analysis by somebody that I follow who follows that, a fellow named Guy Plofsky, who follows Russian aviation industry and Air Force. He indicated the numbers he was pushing were kind of not very impressive as far as the number of aircraft being produced. Is it your sense as well that given the losses they've been experiencing, that may even account for some of the risk aversion that we've been seeing from some of the more advanced platforms that the Russians are using in Ukraine? But what's your sense of the state of the Russian aviation industry?
I think that's a very accurate assessment. I'm not an aircraft expert, but I definitely follow others who pay great attention to that particular field. There is a lot of excellent reporting on some of the issues and problems experienced by Russian Air Force in Ukraine, and especially the losses. Russians are still trying to adapt their aircraft use to Ukrainians' more flexible tactics, and especially to their very capable air defenses. But I think what you indicated is close to the truth, in the sense that Russia did lose a lot, and it did in fact make them risk averse, which is why they are actually using so many Shahed loitering munitions and other types of UAVs in place of manned aircraft and manned aviation.
Domin, can I ask a quick follow-up?
Go for it.
Okay, Samuel, just zoning in a little bit on some of the weapons capability that we've seen in the Russian Air Force. One of the capabilities that really seems to stand out to me as deficient, it seems, and it could be just my perception bias, but we see the Ministry of Defense regularly putting out pictures of some of their more advanced aircraft with, in particular, I'm thinking the KH-31, the anti-radiation variant of that missile. And my sense, and the sense it seems of other people that I've read on Twitter, is that they haven't had as much success with that as maybe the Ukrainians have in the suppression of enemy air defense role. Any thoughts on that particular weapon, and how effectively maybe it was training, maybe it was the weapon itself that is deficient? Any thoughts on that?
I actually really would like to answer that question, but I'm not that well versed in that particular weapon. I know it's been in the news a lot, and I think others are probably way better at providing a detailed explanation. But I think the general arch here that we follow from the very beginning to the present is that a lot of Russian more advanced weapons, and even their less advanced weapons, weren't properly utilized and weren't really very effective. And so Russian military has been trying to change and adapt their tactics, their weapons, and their systems to the constantly evolving Ukrainian defenses, which seem to be, at least for now, one step ahead of the Russians.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Exit.
Thank you so much, Sam. Nice to see you here. Mine's a little bit broader question. With the increased use of smaller drones, specifically in this war, if you were talking to a Ministry of Defense right now about what they should be doing to be ready for war in 5 years, what would you be saying to them?
That's an excellent question. And Nice to hear your voice and put the voice to the Twitter profile. So I think a lot of these advice, or a lot of this type of advice, has been well articulated on Russian language Telegram from Russian military bloggers and others who follow this war basically in the first 6 months. And they're basically telling the MOD to really get off its ass, to look at the evolution of commercial tech, to stop fielding or stop building super expensive platforms, because in this type of war, what has become absolutely essential are throwaway expendable platforms like FPV drones and DJI quadcopters that can cause an enormous amount of damage. Russian Telegram cite the FPV drone cost at just around $500, $600, $700, and it can cause enormous damage or completely destroy a tank or an armored vehicle or any other military system that costs millions. So the cost to target ratio is absolutely in favor of those who field this technology. But one of the biggest, I guess, contentions from those who fight with those who build the systems has been faster production, and that the Russian defense industry needs to be way faster in fielding all manner of systems for the war. And we're seeing indications of that in recent news from today and tomorrow, and yesterday, when Defense Minister Shoigu was saying how the Russian defense industrial sector is meeting the demand, will be manufacturing a lot of weapons and systems in large quantities, and quote unquote, everything will be well because they listen to what is happening on the ground.
Thank you, Sam. Domen, would you like to tell us? Sorry, yeah, you can take over.
Go ahead, Biljana, please.
I don't have a list with the people that were about to ask the question in order, so I'll defer to you on that.
Very well. I think I'll briefly ask a follow-up. I'll briefly ask a follow-up to Exit's question here. Sam, with these, let's say especially the FPV one-way drones, right? How much thought has been put to scalability? I mean, especially thought put into it outside of Russia. Scalability in the sense of not production, but actual utility. You can see how on occasion you can find great utility for it at the margins, right? But how far can you actually push that? I mean, Russians clearly tried that with the Lancet drones. They thought, oh, there's some communications, especially in Russian Telegram. This is almost a wonder weapon. Look at what all it does, and then it just didn't perform that much. It didn't cause all that much damage to Ukrainians. They quickly adapted with these sort of chain link fencing over artillery positions, and they seem to have neutered the effect of it to a great degree. Not to mention that often, it might have blown off a track off of an SPG that the Ukrainians were operating, but it didn't actually disable it properly. So, what's the thought to scalability of these?
I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about Russian UAVs used in the war, we're really talking about different ranges and different distances. Lancets and Kubes operated up to 40 kilometers. And so they're designed to strike targets behind the line of contact. FPV drones have a very short range, right? Just no more than 5 or 6 miles. Sometimes it could be pushed further, but probably no more than 7 or 8 miles in total. So FPV drone is a very dangerous tactical weapon. And because so much military technology, weapons, and systems are usually concentrated at the line of contact, a large number of FPV drones, especially those that can fly in a near future swarm, can have a tremendous impact and cause an enormous amount of damage. And so as the Russian military is trying to kind of understand this threat and adapt its defense industry or adapt its tactics to this newly emergent commercial type of technology, there's a lot of thought about how it can be best used basically in its own place. So an FPV drone cannot fly very far. Lancet drone is best used at targets located a significant distance from the contact line. And drones like Shaheds can be launched from Russian territory proper against Ukrainian targets, which are hundreds of kilometers away from the launch site. And so there's a lot of thought about developing new tactics and new systems and new concepts, rather, But I think the events on the ground, judging from what we see on social media, tend to overtake these sort of top-down approaches. And really the more successful approaches or the bottom-up approaches where commercial type of technology like an FPV drone can be used very successfully against much more expensive military systems located very close to the contact line.
Domin, before you give the floor to the next audience guest for another question, may I pose a question? I see your thumbs up. I'll go with that. Sam, thank you. Sam, from all the analysis that you've done on drone production and supply and development from the Russian government, does it tell you anything about the duration of conflict that Russia is preparing for? Because we have all these discussions about is Russia fighting a war of attrition? How many years can Russia sustain a military effort in Ukraine? Does Russia's drone policy or technology policy in general, as you are seeing it right now, tell you anything about that?
Well, judging from official statements, judging from what is coming from the Kremlin, from Putin himself, from the military, Russia is prepared for long-term fighting. It's preparing for years of this type of warfare to really grind down and wear down Ukrainian defenders. And Russia hopes to wait out the Western assistance and Western response and get to the point where no more aid would be available for the Ukrainians because the conflict is now dragging on for many, many years. That is the sentiment, and that is the sort of that is what we're hearing from the Kremlin, and that's what we're trying to understand. Whether or not Russian economy can handle that type of brunt and pressure, whether its defense industrial complex can handle it, is a different story. And I think that story is still unfolding. We're witnessing Russian military take its near ancient tanks out of storage to send to Ukraine in place of more advanced ones that were lost. What does that mean for the defense industry? Can these modernized tanks or tanks with slightly more advanced technologies basically applied to them be as effective as more modern and more advanced tanks that Ukraine is about to receive? These are the questions that really guide our understanding of how Russia is preparing for this conflict. But at least from public statements, they are preparing for years of this type of war.
Thank you, Sam. Domin, you can go to the next question.
Yeah, they might hope it, but I hope they never get to achieve it. Certainly not that way. Let's go to Jinga. Jinga, concise question, please.
Okay, very quick. So very quick is my curiosity as to what do you guys see as Jack Ma's return to China means for this conflict. Do you see any connection or anything? That's my curiosity. That's it.
Are you asking if Russia is going to have a more extensive cooperation with China?
I think the assumption should be they are already in that incorporation. It's just how they are going to conduct it. Because you said there are a lot of volunteers, and we need to know sending quote unquote volunteer is the modus operandi for Communist China to aid people it wants to aid in any conflict, be it in Korea War or Vietnam War. The Ho Chi Minh City was supported by a bunch of quote unquote volunteers. That's a modus operandi. So now there are people as volunteers purchasing components from AliExpress, which is founded by Jack Ma. And my assumption is the AliExpress is the new Ho Chi Minh City, Ho Chi Minh Trail. For that reason, I'm asking if you guys are paying attention to what Jack Ma's return might mean to this war. That's my question. That's my longer form of the question.
A very interesting question. So I'm not a China expert, but I'm following Sino-Russian technology and economic and military cooperation. I think when it comes to AliExpress as a platform, right, China's official statement is that it's a commercial platform, and it can't control or police where some of the products sold on that platform end up, because a lot of these are basically commercial or dual-use components intended for peaceful purposes. And it's difficult to trace and to track some of these components as they flow from AliExpress onwards. Obviously, there are some issues with that. For example, Russian citizens couldn't buy products from AliExpress for 24 hours just a few weeks ago. For those shopping from Russia proper who had a Russia-based IP address, they couldn't access AliExpress, but the access was then restored after 24 hours so that people can continue shopping and basically developing this, as you said, technological Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is a very apt description, and I might borrow it for the future. I don't know exactly what the fate of that type of acquisition is going to be. Whether it will continue as before, it will continue unimpeded, or whether China will try to do something to prevent the flow of a lot of technology sold on the platform to Russia. Military products.
Yeah, very quick follow-up. Jack Ma himself is a Communist Party member. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if China says this is a commercial platform, that's again an acknowledgement that we will find ways to do it. That's how to read it. Just like China was citing that the Ho Chi Minh Trail is part of some boring country, right? China had no control. But if you find out what's going on, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was operated by a bunch of Chinese volunteers. That's basically the way to read it. Now, the new AliExpress is a new Ho Chi Minh Trail. Yes, it's difficult. Just like supplying a modern military campaign through a jungle trail in the Southeast Asia known as Ho Chi Minh Trail is difficult, but can be done to prolong the war, to achieve the geopolitical ends, meet the ambition of CCP. That's my point.
I think it's an apt point. Like I said, I think we're watching the evolution of Sino-Russian cooperation, and we're definitely watching how far China is going to go in supplying military technologies or other overt military assistance to the Russian military.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let's go to another Alex, then to the roof and back to exit. Another Alex.
Hi there. I had someone who, as a hobbyist, makes autonomous quadcopters just for fun, or used to. I found it quite astonishing, given like the amount of academic papers and freely downloadable code for autopilots of GitHub, that the Russian drones are so incapable, considering what is freely available out there. The other, I guess, counterpoint to Jingu can be is like, I could deep dive into this in terms of the supply chains for making composite materials. So these quadcopters are normally made with carbon fiber reinforced plastic plates. Now that may only be 20% of the bill of materials for a quadcopter, but if you don't have the frame, you don't have a quadcopter. So I think if it's of interest, I don't know how much time there is, I could point out some serious problems with the ability of AliExpress to deliver that Silk Road, because you may get everything you need apart from most of the bits for the airframe. Now that may only be 20% of the bill of materials, but if you don't have an airframe, you don't have a quadcopter.
Actually, that's a very good point, and I think every discussion about commercial quadcopter technologies, commercial UAVs, should have people like yourself who are actually working on these technologies. I think what I'm seeing on Russian Telegram channels is that people 3D print the frames at the front as they 3D print other key components, while a lot of electronics and other important technologies are coming from AliExpress and other marketplaces.
Yeah, so there's a lot of the complex 3D shape stuff can be 3D printed, but the board structure, which allows them to be assembled so fast and cheaply, is essentially water jet cut, just flat carbon fiber reinforced plastic plates. This is specifically for the quadcopters. For the drones, they need more technology, where the supply chains are overwhelmingly dominantly European based. The Chinese do make carbon fiber. I've tested the stuff which is allowed to be exported. It's crap. They do have fibers which look very impressive on paper, but I've never tested them because they're not allowed to be exported. So whether AVIC or their supply chain are going to allow their Gucci carbon fibers to be going into drones is an interesting manner, as they do not, to my knowledge, allow export to date. The only time I've seen data from it from the West is by AVIC, which is a big Chinese aerospace organization, funded researchers placed in Western universities.
Interesting point, and this is something that I'd like to hear, and I learn something new every day as I try to observe how both sides are using quadcopters. I'm also watching how a lot of the volunteer efforts across Russia are also assembling FPV type of drones in large numbers, frame, electronics, and other components included. So I'm assuming they either purchase all of it wholesale at AliExpress or they build them domestically.
Yeah, and that's the interesting one. So one of the key ingredients for these quadcopter airframes is literally just you make a massive flat sheet of carbon fiber reinforced plastic, and you get a water jet CNC cutter to literally cut it out into a kit, and you just package it off and you send it. There is domestic capacity for it, but compared to what is available in Europe, it is trivial. So when you look at the amount of money U-24's raised for FPV kamikaze drones, Ukraine does not make carbon fiber reinforced plastic sheets domestically. So they are procuring that from, I presume, European supply chains. And the capacity in Europe is absolutely enormous. The capacity in China may be there, but it's probably relying on Japanese, European, or American carbon fibers. And if that's, China considers carbon fiber production a strategic industry, I would also suggest it's interesting to note that AVIC, despite unlimited almost government funding, have still been completely incapable of getting remotely close to making a composite airframe, despite the fact that the West has been doing it for decades. So in terms of where the supply chain bottlenecks are and where real pain on drones can be inflicted, yeah, the electronics and the mechatronics, that's Asia. But if your airframe relies on composite materials, you're relying on the West, essentially, and that may be a pain point. It's probably the reason why China has designated that supply chain as a strategically important industry, which they have not developed yet.
Interesting. I really appreciate your commentary here.
Happy to nerd out about it. It's literally my job.
Excellent. I'm always a fan when we can have a thorough exchange of knowledge as well as thoughts. Let's go on. Rauf, straight to the point, please.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Samuel. I want to ask you this. What do you think about that first day Russia war against Ukraine of Turkish drone Bayraktar rules in first day of war? And also, my second question is, today I saw that Radio Liberty report about that Ukraine army soldiers research Iranian Shahed drones, and so many complex of Shahed drones made some mechanical system made from Japan, US. I didn't understand what's happening. I mean, who provide technology for Iran? Also, I saw that the Russian propaganda said that his mate produced some technological equipment. What do you think about that? And the last question is, what do you think? Do you think that China any provides technological producing for Russia? Thank you.
Well, the Bayraktars and similar drones were very effective against Russian forces because in the opening days and even weeks of the war, Russia really didn't have very good air defense and electronic warfare established. Once Russian air defense was basically well established, and once the concept and tactics were finally applied, the Bayraktars were targeted, and so Ukraine lost a number of them. And so there are fewer of them today on missions like the ones that were conducted initially in the war. And the issue is drones like Bayraktar and equivalent Russian drones like Orion or even Iranian Mohajer 6 drone, which are, Russian forepost, not Orion. They're in the same class. They're relatively slow flying drones. They don't fly very high. And once identified by air defense, they make a very quick target. And so Russia was able to shoot down a number of these Bayraktars. As far as Iranian Shahed drone full of imported components, I think that's the genius of this particular innovation, that Iranians were able to manufacture a drone that can fly far and is relatively cheap to manufacture and produce precisely because it is full of imported components, which again are dual use and civilian in nature, and it is very difficult to track them. around the world. So Iran may have acquired these basically from any number of parties, any number of enterprises, and even those who manufacture those components may not be aware where their technologies end up. I know you asked several other questions about sort of Russian technological capability, but I think I will kind of give you a summary answer. Is that when it comes to sanctions in general, when it comes to commercial technologies and dual-use technologies, those are rather difficult to track completely. And an enormous global effort has to be undertaken in order to track and prevent the flow of these technologies to a country like Russia, not just by going after the importers or organizations or bodies or companies that actually do that, but also going, not necessarily going after, but negotiating and talking with partner nations and allies of Russia who serve as transshipment points for these type of technologies, countries like Kazakhstan or Georgia or Armenia or Turkey or other nations.
Last question is about China providing technical.
That's right. Well, again, I don't think China is providing any overt technical assistance to Russia. I think they're careful to kind of walk the line right now. There was recent news about China providing Russia with some rifles and body armor and $12 million worth of drone parts. But I think the Chinese supply of military technology to Russia will depend on how this war is conducted and how Russia does in this conflict. But China's trying to kind of walk the middle ground here between a country that is considered its ally in many respects and between the global response and China's basically integration into the global economy and interdependence with many countries around the world, United States and Europe included.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Samuel. Exit, go ahead.
So just a quick follow-up to my last and then one new question. Manpower changes. Sam, are there specific manpower changes that you think Defense Department should be working towards now that would prepare them for an increased use of drones in wars? And then secondarily, what are the areas that you think drones should be adopted or could be adopted that we haven't seen happen in Ukraine so far? Places where they could be more useful than people are using them.
Excellent question. I think the Defense Department is paying very, very close attention to the lessons learned from Ukraine, especially the application of commercial tech like DJI and FPV drones. I think there's a lot of effort in trying to understand this impact from different services, especially the Army and the US Marines. As far as the place for these drones in future wars, I think it will depend in large part on how comfortable the services are with the use of this technology and whether or not significant and effective countermeasures exist to their operation. For example, a lot of DJI drones aren't really EW proofed, meaning they're not really proofed against electronic warfare countermeasures in any significant extent and are often lost very easily to EW countermeasures. FPV drones are sometimes less susceptible to EW, but they could be susceptible to other countermeasures. So the application of these technologies in large numbers will also go hand in hand with the development of countermeasures to their successful application as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Exit, I hope that was all you bargained for. Let's go to last two questions. Let's go to Christa and then to Matthias, and then I'll pass it back to Diana. Christa.
Hello, mic check.
All good?
Okay. Yeah, I actually spoke with you, Domen, earlier today about this, but it's great to be able to ask Mr. Bendit about this. A bit of a comment about the previous gentleman who spoke about carbon fiber. Actually, you don't need to use carbon fiber at all, and people don't use them for long-range FPV solutions and drones like that because carbon fiber blocks radio transmission, and it's not the material that you would like. Simple fiberglass, which Russia has tons of it, is very, very much the same for such big birds. and they have enough production power to do this. So that was one of my concerns, that eventually, when they catch up with the drone game, I don't see any blocker. They can buy very cheap and very well working stuff from AliExpress. They have enough engineers. All the champions of scale modeling, FPV stuff like that, most of them are Russian, sponsored by the Russian government. That's one of the reasons they're beating everyone else. Because, for example, they get a real MiG-29 to play with, so they can make a perfect copy. Anyway, but I'm pretty concerned about this, and I don't think there is an actual real stopper in front of them besides their incompetence and their leadership to mass produce drones. And my question is, what are the odds? What are our capabilities to geofence or completely shut down GPS as a service over Russia and over the entire battlefront in Ukraine, if that would benefit Ukraine more than it harms its capabilities? How viable is that as a solution to prevent them using the public GPS system? And yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
It's an interesting question. I'm not an expert on these type of technologies. I think it's difficult to shut down a system that has so many civilian and dual use applications. Obviously, Ukrainians are also using GPS as well. Russians have been claiming that they are using their own GPS equivalent, the GLONASS, in place of GPS. GLONASS is not as precise, is not as ubiquitous, but could actually be used in some weapons and systems. And so the presence of equivalence to GPS may determine how Russia acts and reacts and what the international response may be to their use of this type of satellite technology.
All right, thank you very much. I see that we've been joined by Bob Crowley.
Hi. Yes, first let me say thank you very much, Sam and Bilyana. This has been incredible. Really appreciate it. Now, my question is, I'm looking for any context you can give on Russia's intentions regarding war in space. As you know, they tested an anti-satellite very dangerously in November before the invasion. And just last October, a foreign ministry leader was making threats, calling out SpaceX and Starlink. And I wanted to ask for any context you can provide that would help us better comprehend Russia's intentions with war in space. Perhaps you can give us some indicators of what we will see before they start attacks. Over.
It's an excellent question. I don't have a very good indication of how Russia is willing to go. What we have seen so far is that nothing is probably off the table for the Russians. They've been already nuclear signaling recently by indicating the possible position of tactical nukes in Belarus. And if they're able to signal in that fashion, they can probably signal with some of the space-based capabilities. Obviously, Russia is one of the foremost space powers in the world right now, on the par with the United States and ahead of many other countries. And they have different capabilities. They're definitely watching how space is used in the war in Ukraine. They're watching the impact of Starlink. And nothing is probably, again, I'm going to repeat myself, but nothing is probably off the table at this point. But the use of or escalation to that level will be determined how Russia basically fares in the war in the next couple of months. So definitely watch the skies.
Great. Thanks, Bilyana. Do you have context on this?
Bob, for me, I don't have anything to add to Sam's position. I also think that we're seeing the nuclear option being discussed, and I'm also monitoring to see what is going to happen going forward. But yeah, this will be my answer. I think Sam gave a very comprehensive answer.
Thank you both. Really appreciate it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And Matthias.
Yeah, thanks, Domin. My question is, we're going to see a ground offensive most likely pretty soon from Ukraine. And my question is, given the capabilities and types of drones that both Ukraine and Russia have at their disposal, also considering the level of training for drone pilots and the like, what are the roles you see? Like, how do you see Ukraine using drones and unmanned vehicles to support the ground offensive that we're likely going to see? So not necessarily in general, but more like specifically, what do you expect to see there? That's my question.
Well, Russians are in fact very concerned about the impending mass-scale use of FPV drones by Ukrainian military. They're concerned that Ukraine has more of them. They're concerned that Ukraine has trained more FPV drone operators than the Russians. They're concerned that these drones can fly in a swarm and target Russian air defenses, EW, or anything at or beyond the line of contact. And so these drones are going to be absolutely essential at the tactical level, at the tactical edge, to enable Ukraine to target, identify, track, and destroy Russian assets on the ground. Beyond that, it's difficult to understand the actual Russian response. Russians are also trying to train FPV operators. They're trying to assemble FPV drones. But for example, training an FPV operator is very different from training a regular quadcopter operator, and others can weigh in here. It can take just a few days for someone to become relatively proficient in flying a commercial quadcopter, but FPV racing is very different. And so it takes much longer to train the operator. So the loss of one such operator will be profoundly felt. Or the presence of such an operator at the front, for example, in Ukraine, will be an enormous asset for the Ukrainian military. So that's what the Russians are discussing right now. They're also talking about the ever-present danger of quadcopters as intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, as combat elements. They're talking about heavier commercial drones used by Ukrainians to drop heavier munitions and grenades on Russian positions. And Ukraine has been signaling that it is also working on the development of long-range drones that can target not just Russian positions in Ukraine, but Russia proper. And several such successful strikes were conducted last year and this year. And the Russians are concerned that their air defense systems may not be enough to cover the entire country from the impending Ukrainian UAV threat.
Okay, so maybe I missed this. I was late coming here. So FPV, is that first person view, or sorry,
yes.
I wasn't know the terminology.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's a
and what's the
racing
main
drone.
difference? What's the main difference between an FPV drone and a quadcopter?
So an FPV drone can fly way, way, way faster than a quadcopter. It can fly at around 100 miles or even beyond that. FPV drones don't fly very high, but they can hug the ground because the operator basically, in piloting this drone, becomes the drone. And so the operator can actually have the FPV drone hug the ground. It can fly around the obstacles. A commercial quadcopter is a much slower flying machine, but it can fly higher than an FPV drone. And an FPV drone can carry a significant munition on some of their missions, like an RPG warhead. Some of the commercial quadcopters can only carry light munitions, like light grenades.
Before we go to the next question, Sam, I want to be respectful of your time. I asked you to join us for an hour, and we're already 21 minutes over the hour. How much longer can you stay with us to answer questions?
Well, let's go for another 10 minutes. Let's make this an hour and a half.
All right, very good.
Awesome. Thank you. Amen.
Sam, thank you so much for joining us. Good evening from Cairo. To tie it to Bob's question about the Russian footprint in space. So far we know that they have at least 25 GLONASS satellites, maybe 40 something communication satellites, at least 6 for the missile warning system, 7 for electronic reconnaissance, 2 or 3 topographic satellites, 2 radar location satellites, 2 optical reconnaissance satellites, and other experimental devices that they launched to demonstrate new technologies. Judging by their performance throughout their campaign and their inability, it seems, to use those reconnaissance assets to provide their troops with intelligence that they can use on the battlefield, and also their failure to launch new generation satellites throughout 2021, 2023. Some of those satellites didn't make it into orbit, and others, after making it into orbit, basically stopped operating. Again, how do you see the future of their satellite or their space footprint? And why aren't they capable of using what they already have in space to provide their troops with any reliable or actionable intelligence? And we've heard one of their officials basically saying to Putin that we cannot target Ukrainian assets because they're being moved at night, which is quite ironic, basically. Any thoughts or any opinions on that?
Excellent question. One of the answers I learned to give over the past year is that I don't know, and I don't have an answer to that. It is difficult sometimes for us to analyze what is happening in Russia proper while we're observing the war on social media, or we're observing it from, or at a distance, rather, in different countries. So I don't have a good understanding of why Russia is unable to use its space-based and other high-tech assets. But there are experts who do know the answer to that, and I invite you to take a look at what they've said and written online about it. Not everything is easily explainable when it comes to the Russian military. Not everything can be explained by government issues or mistakes or ineptitudes by the MOD. Sometimes there are other technological and more important issues at play.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another Alex?
Yeah, forgive me. This is more of a comment. So someone mentioned something earlier about fiberglass for quadcopters or FPV drones. You can use fiberglass. You're going to be giving up a lot of weight and performance if you do. But also the thing I would like to draw people's attention to is you can go to United 24's Twitter page or U24 and look at the NAFO squadron. And if you've been here a while, you can look at the evolution of Ukraine's FPV kamikaze drones, which previously had 2 layers of carbon fiber cut from a flat sheet, which were bolted together in a way that would give my manufacturing engineers nightmares. And if you look at the one that is now on their little cartoon, the entire airframe is essentially a thick billet of carbon fiber reinforced plastic, which has been cut. Now, if you have modern advanced composite materials with highly damage tolerant plastic parts, it's not just carbon fiber, it's carbon fiber reinforced plastic, then you can use conventional machining tools as long as you use the correct cutting bits and adapt your machining process to cut those things. If you don't have access to highly bespoke specialized cutting tools and machining spindles, which are essentially only available in the West, then you will obliterate your carbon fiber panel if you try and cut it this way. Russia does not have this because they do not have the domestic industry for this. China does not have this as far as I have seen. Europe does, America does. So when it comes to why is the carbon fiber and the supply chain important, is to produce these at high throughput.
We lost audio, right? We lost.
Oh, sorry. Or you need a specialist piece of equipment called a water jet cutter, which is widely prevalent in the West because we have composites everywhere here. So when people talking about 50,000 Ukrainian drones, entirely plausible if you have contract manufacturers in Europe backing them up. If Russia tried to do that, where is the contract manufacturers? Where is the supply chain to deliver it? So this could be very interesting because there's no roadblocks to Russia. It's a supply chain issue. And as far as I can see, if you don't have the airframes and you don't have a supply chain to deliver it, this is completely asymmetric and in favor of Ukraine.
And it's something where hopefully sanctions can have a good effect, right, Sam?
Well, it's an interesting one. I mentioned, Japanese and American, European fibers. The Koreans actually make phenomenal carbon fibers at a given price point, whereas the Chinese don't have anything that I've tested, which appears to be anything other than a waste of space. So it's a supply chain issue. It's these little bits in the supply chain. Okay, you can do all of this, but who's that person who has that machine and that capability to do it? Europe has it in spades. I don't think Russia certainly doesn't. I'm not sure China does, and I don't see the Koreans and the Japanese stepping in.
Sam, if you don't want to comment that, because it's pretty self-contained, I'll ask you one last question. We've been talking an awful lot about things that fly. We haven't touched at all about things that stay on land or indeed go on water. Now, those tend to be slightly more nascent technologies, right? But where do you see the utility of that going forward in trying to avert, especially the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
So you're asking about basically the development of maritime unmanned vehicles and ground-based unmanned vehicles, correct?
Yeah, and do you reckon there's any utility going to come forward for Ukrainians in their fight for liberation?
Well, I think Ukrainians have demonstrated that they can use surface unmanned systems with relative success against Russian fleets. Even if the damage is relatively slight from some of these attacks, they demonstrate the need for Russian military to expend resources in trying to defend against such unmanned surface vessels or USVs. Ground vehicles represent a slightly different development. Prior to the war, Russian military and its defense industries were developing multiple types of UGVs for combat, for ISR, large, mid-size, small ones. But most are remote controlled right now. And the real use for all of these systems can be when they're fully autonomous, when they do not actually depend on a connection with the operator, when they can choose their path to target on their own. We're not there yet, but we're inching closer to that ideal that has been described for so long by Russian military academia and Russian military experts in Russia as inevitable path to future warfare. And I think Ukrainians are also aware of that. Russia uses several types of demining UGVs right now, but they're also remote controlled. And there are also a lot of volunteer-based efforts. There's plenty of videos and telegrams, some of which I have reposted, by people actually building small-scale UGVs to deliver bombs or to conduct ISR or to basically participate in close-range combat. Those are also remote-controlled systems. And the fact that they're remote control places the operator in relative proximity. One of the more interesting cases about the attack, the Ukrainian USV attack against a Russian port last year, was how these USVs were guided to target. And when the full autonomous application finally arrives, all of these systems, aerial, ground-based, maritime, are going to be enormous mission multipliers for the fighting armies because they're going to start taking out soldiers and other crewed members from dangerous frontline combat. We're not there yet, but this is the ideal that the Russians are envisioning. And this is probably where we might end up at some point in the future if we actually perfect our technologies.
Sam, thank you so much for your answer. And it's 11:30 PT right now, and we're very grateful that you managed to share an hour and a half with us and that you share your remarkable expertise. I see that there are other questions. We can have some back for another round in the future. Thank you so much to everyone for being so engaging and especially to Sam for joining us.
I really appreciate the participation and thank you for having me on this podcast. You can follow me on Twitter and you can ping me with questions that way. Look forward to other discussions and subsequent appearances. Thanks again. Thanks to Biljana. Thanks to Domen.
Thank you for joining us, Sam. And Biljana, you started strong when it comes to bringing guests for Biljana's Battlefield Hour.
Oh, absolutely. Did you doubt me?
I know better.
You know better. Thank you, everyone. And we'll have another guest shortly. I'll announce who that would be, and we'll continue with the theme of technology, cyber, and disinformation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Biljana. Thank you, Sam. If have a round of applause. If you click the little heart plus button at the bottom, you can click the little clappy and heart emojis and show your appreciation that way. It's a very civilized way, I have to say, compared to even compared to an actual raucous applause in a live setting. All right, Ming the Merciless.
Viewed Russia, as someone who emigrated from Russia in, I think he said 1989. I can still hear a slight Russian accent, but anyway, we've lost him now. I'll ask him in a tweet.
Very good. Ming, I got a question for you. If you had 28 million rubles burning a hole in your pocket, what would you do with them?
It's to do with buying Western aircraft.
Yeah, so Aeroflot is Air India do a purchase order for 400 something Western aircraft, right? And they said, we can do one better. We can order what did they say, 4,000?
Yeah, 4,400.
Don't they have enough Western aircraft? I mean, they just scaled back operations. Why do they need more Western aircraft?
Well, it turns out these are model aircraft. So they're ordering a whole ton of model aircraft because, and I suspect it's because they're looking to diversify their revenue sources because they're probably hurting a bit. So I don't know. They're ordering 4,400, and the picture of the model in question is an Aeroflot A320, and it's a Pac-Min model, which is like, they're quite expensive. They can cost several $1,000s if you go for the really big ones. But the ones they're looking at, they cost about maybe $300, $400 each. And I guess they want to put a big markup on them. Maybe they're actually trolling. Maybe they're saying, okay, we're sanctioned. We're not allowed aircraft parts, but we'll buy 4,400 A320s from Pac-Min to troll the West and then flog them to our poor benighted customers at a huge markup.
I mean, Ming, wouldn't the Russian way be that they just ordered 4,000 of them off of Alibaba, pay 10% of the price, and then, I don't know, what can you buy for 25 million rubles, Ming? A Lada, maybe?
To be honest, I don't know. I mean, what's the exchange rate? Is it like 70 or something at the moment?
Yeah, it's about that. In practice, it's about 100, but let's forget about that. It doesn't really matter. So let's say that you're looking at $30,000, something like that in spare money. That buys a Lada still, just about.
Yeah,
I mean, it doesn't have airbags, but
yeah, you can get a Lada for that. I don't know if you can get a new one, but because what with all the huge demand. But it's a Lada or 4,400 A320s from Pac-Man. It's like.
At least the engines won't leak fuel everywhere on these ones. I think they can assure that.
Yeah, they're solid resin models, those things. They do break, and then you need to get that special glue because not any old glue will fix them. But yeah, no, you're right. They won't have any, and they won't kill anybody. That's the other big advantage.
That's what you think. Shaggy.
Yeah, Ming. That's about half a coffee machine, isn't it? So can you get a coffee machine for like 30,000 for a smaller plane? I remember the 60,000-pound coffee machine from the other day.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe you can, or maybe if you're just ordering a 737 instead of a 74, you can get away with a smaller coffee machine. But I actually think that it's probably the same coffee machine because you're dealing with the same number of coffee drinkers, i.e. the pilots.
Maybe one halfway through its life then.
Yeah, buy a cheap one on the second-hand market.
Alibaba again.
No, I'm sorry, it'd have to be a bit older than halfway.
Just to explain to the listeners what we're talking about here, I did a financing for a 747-400 freighter, and looking through the list of the buyer furnished equipment, i.e. all the extras that the airline wanted from Boeing, there was a coffee machine to serve coffee for the pilots that cost $60,000.
So, I mean, if you did get, one that was half amortized, how much would certifying it to move it from one aircraft to another and certifying that cost? Because, you see what I mean? You need to get one slightly older than halfway through amortization to offset that cost.
Yeah, to be honest, I have no idea. I have no idea what components will be needed to be checked or replaced or whatever. And on top of that, I kind of think, yeah, I mean, is there a trade in secondhand coffee machines for aircraft? There probably is, actually. If you break up a 737, could you flog the coffee machine? You probably could. So I don't know. I can ask around, though. I can ask my industry contacts and find out about the cost of these coffee machines.
Well, I, for one, would love to know. There's nothing better than a massively overpriced coffee machine for purely regulatory reasons. Delta Bravo.
Hey there. Small world. So I used to buy and sell commercial aircraft. So the reason why that $65,000 coffee machine is $65,000, as you know, they got to test it, right? And testing something on a 747, which includes getting the 747 airborne and going through the tests, just the test itself is $40,000 of fuel plus $50,000 of pilot time, right? It's, to your point, it's the certification. And yes, there is a massive market for these parts being traded, as off market, etc. So it's it's not the making of the coffee maker. It's the getting the coffee maker into the airplane and then testing it so that, its electricals don't cause a short and then ground the entire aircraft, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what makes it so expensive. And as you can imagine, testing anything on a 747 costs an insane amount of money, because you're using test pilots who are the most highly paid pilots on Earth, right? Because they're flying an aircraft that's technically not airworthy. So these are like the best, the most expensive types of pilots you can possibly have, are these people who do tests. But anyway, so it's getting it onto the airplane. That's the issue, and making it a certified part. But yes, there is an amazing aftermarket for these things. They range for between $5,000 and $10,000, and that's just because they're $60,000 when they're new. It's just the wonderful world of commercial aerospace. So it's all about the testing.
As long as you can test several things at once, right? Because clearly you can. Otherwise, it'd be at least 90,000.
Yeah, but it's true. But there's only one part number that has been made for that aircraft, so it's a monopoly that's been tested, and the monopoly for the part number exists because it's been tested, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's just it's really it's the getting it on the airplane, and to make it an OEM part that just explodes everything, and then they got to go through a whole process of, it's a new thing in an airplane, therefore they got to test everything else that it touches, and da 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 da. It just never ends. It's really that, and those engineers are not cheap engineers, right? So it just keeps going and going and going and going, and then lo and behold, $50 worth of material becomes a $60,000 coffee machine. So, high tech workers. It's a crazy world.
Shaggy.
Yeah, you go.
Well, I want to know, does it actually make good coffee?
No, it doesn't.
I mean,
but if you go into a factory where they maintain aircraft engines, for example, and I've been to many of those, and I bought and sold a few of them. There's literally pictures up on the wall for the workers, and they'll show a part, whatever that part is. They'll put a big equal sign, and then they'll put a Ferrari next to it as a way of reminding the workers, please don't drop this piece of metal because it costs as much as a Ferrari, right? And they have all these pictures up on the wall. This part equals a Corvette Stingray, and this part equals a Ferrari. In the big San Francisco maintenance bay where they're doing the large turbofan engines, every blade on that engine's $100,000, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're like, please don't drop this stuff, because when you do, you got to go through a whole bunch of stuff because each part's a Ferrari. It's just nuts. The amount of money is just nuts for commercial aircraft, especially for the engines. Just crazy, crazy numbers. So.
And of course, it's not the coffee is not any good because the pressure is too low.
Well, the coffee is not good, and also it's coffee that's probably prepared by the flight crew, and it's probably airline coffee grains, right? So it's not good coffee. It's just.
So DB, since you know stuff about plane parts and how much stuff costs. So yesterday we were looking at that engine on the Nordwind Airlines that blew up. Well, didn't blow up. Just the fuel went everywhere.
Yeah.
On a 737, how big of a job is that? And how hard is it to get the right?
So I thought there was a 767 Nordwind. Was it a 73 or a 76?
Said 73.
Oh, 73.
737-800.
Yeah, so if it's a major blowout like that requires a major overhaul, that's probably a $5 to $6 million overhaul just to do the overhaul of the engine. But then if you don't have a spare engine, you got to put that engine into shop. It'll take about 120 man days. So that's called TATs, the amount of time it would take for that engine to be in shop, because that's a big overhaul on that 73. I'm assuming it's a CFM engine. No, they're all CFMs on 73s anyways. There's no other manufacturer. But so that'd be a $4 or $5 million overhaul. It would be in the shop for 90 days, which means you'd have to rent a spare. Now the Russians don't have access to spares, so they have to find a spare CFM to stick on that overhaul. So it's an insane amount of money. You know, I was curious.
So it's a serious thing.
It is.
It's not just they put a cork in it and it's fine now.
I was curious if it's a 7.6. If it's a 7.6, then I would have actually sold that airplane to Nordwind a long time ago. But no, if it's it's probably $4 or $5 million. If it's a 7.6, it can be even worse to do the overhaul, but less of a problem to do the spares, because there's a large spare market for spare engines for 7.6 engines. But it's very hard to get a spare for a 7.3 because there's just so much demand. So that's $4 or $5 million out, and God knows what else they have to do, and they have to retest everything. And I don't know what type of test cells, test capabilities they have in Russia to even test the engine. And nobody in their right mind will do a bootleg overhaul of that, because they'll lose their license and they'll lose access to parts. So they can't just sneak the engine out to somebody and have that person maintain the engine, right? So the $4 or $5 million number is kind of theoretical, because you won't find anybody who is going to lose their license to work the engine.
We do have to remember,
you know.
Oh, we carry on.
No, DB, it was definitely a 738.
It was a 738. Okay, so it's a CFM 56-7. Yeah, so that
and it sprang a fuel leak. If you take a look at my timeline, you'll find it.
Okay, so but did it cause an engine failure, or was it just a fire?
No, it was just a big fuel leak. They fixed it in an hour, and the plane took.
Okay, so I didn't realize the engine. If the engine wasn't fully damaged, I assume the engine was damaged based on what I heard. I didn't look at it in detail. If we're talking about buying the externals and all the external parts of those, that's probably $500,000. If it's not in the engine, I thought the engine had a fault event. It didn't have a fault event. It was okay. Then it's fine. Then it's $500,000. But they still got to get their hands on the parts. That's not easy to find. You know, they must be cannibalizing all of their airplanes, right? That's the only way they can do this. So they're gonna do like the Iranians did, which would have these ghost airplanes that are living off of a black market of parts that they just keep flying forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And the difference between them and the Iranians is they stole hundreds, so they can do this for a rather long time. The Iranians didn't have access to hundreds of airplanes, right? So, but they're just gonna cannibalize them over time. You know, so Okay, I didn't realize it wasn't a full engine failure, just external. So that's not 4 or 5 million. That's a $500,000. There you go.
Cheers. And of course, Russians quite famously, including that plane that, where was it in Thailand? Phuket, I think, had an issue a few months ago. That wasn't checked the engines weren't checked in 3 years.
Yeah.
And I think that says something about it.
Yeah.
With that,
yeah, because they probably didn't do the checks because of the sanctions. Although,
even before that,
but even
it's been 3 years, right?
Yeah, but then if they hadn't done anything for a year leading up to the start of the war, because the war's been like a year and a half, that's not necessarily a big deal because it's a CFM56R7. They have pretty high intervals, so you can kind of not having checked it for like a major check for like a year and a half isn't a big deal. But then when you add another year or so for the war, now you're at 2 or 3 years. That's a big deal. You know what I mean? Like the prior time before the war isn't as much of a big deal, but 2-3 years is a big deal. But one and a half.
It's more like they should have done it just around the time when sanctions kicked in, and then gotcha. All right. On that, gentlemen, I will say my goodbyes and talk to you all tomorrow.
All right. Thank you, Derman. Good evening, everyone. It's 10 to 9 p.m. Cairo local time, which is 1 hour now behind Kiev, which is UTC +3. And I will be your co-host for the next few hours. Let's go with the order of the hands. We have Ali 666. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Hello, everybody. I wanted to ask the panel of aviation experts here, since you might know about engines and stuff like that. Is it true that the blades on the jet engine, they are manufactured in such a way that it is one blade is one crystal? Is there any truth to that? Because that might actually explain a lot of the price, since it's very hard to make. Thanks.
One crystal, you say, or just one continuous alloy that is cast?
Yeah, I mean, one continuous crystal, the whole blade.
Well, I'm no aviation expert, but every engineering student during the first year have to pass an industrial production course. So as far as I know, I took my industrial production course between September and January 2001, 2002, and we learned a little bit about casting iron and casting alloys. So I would assume that every single fin would be one solid cast, but that's as far as I know.
Okay. Well, yeah, absolutely one continuous cast, but they apparently have a technique to make the, how do you call it, the molecular matrix of the alloy, like homogeneous throughout the whole cast, which apparently helps with heat resistance and stuff like that also.
That's metallurgy. So that's the science of deciding on the type of metals that you want in your cast to satisfy a certain specification. Metallurgy is concerned with the crystal structure of the alloy that you're using. So very broadly again, and I'm winging it here, you come up with a certain specification of operation. So you need a certain level of heat resistance, you need a certain level of aerodynamic resistance, impact resistance, operation, shear stress and cut stress and other types of stress subjected to the system that you are building. And depending on that, you try to satisfy that equation by developing an alloy that is both strong enough and cheap enough to produce. So it's about satisfying an equation where you assign resources, uh, rare earth metals or any type of metals that you have to create an alloy that would satisfy the specifications required for the engineering application that you're constructing a part for. Again, this is a very broad understanding of metallurgy and casting metals.
Yep. Thanks. That was actually a good answer there. And if I can keep with the aviation theme, do we know any more about the rumors that France is going to maybe give these Mirage planes to Ukraine?
As far as I'm aware, France is very interested in selling Rafale fighter jets in several models to several client countries. And many countries are still operating the Mirage 2000 in several variants. It would make sense that they would try to buy back some of those Mirages from different countries and provide them with Rafale to fill the gap. The rumor is that they were going to buy older Mirages operated by the United Arab Emirates. As far as I know, it will be the Mirage 2000D variant. Now, whether or not the Emiratis will be willing to sell those and the time schedule for replacing them with newer versions of French fighter jets is something that I don't know. I guess we will see, and it makes perfect sense if France wants to sell new systems to approach providing Ukraine with assistance this way. They get orders for their fighter jets, so their factories keep running, and their jobs keep going, and the client countries would receive newer airframes and newer capabilities, and instead of supporting those variants for a longer period of time, they can buy them back, get a discount on a new deal, and get to send those to Ukraine. I guess over the next few weeks, we'll know whether or not they will be doing this or not. But so far, it remains a rumor. I believe we have just been joined by Latin American Military Aviation. Probably he has something to say about this. Please go ahead, sir.
Hey, thanks, Sam, and nice to hear you again, man. It's you've been a while since I heard you. Always good to hear you on here. Yeah, that Mirage situation we were discussing it this morning, and it's a little bit hard to pin down exactly what's going on, except to say that the signals that have come out from the French government is, to my mind, anyways, since about February, that something is happening there. That I think they are actively trying to put together a number of 2000s that they can donate to Ukraine. So far, the aircraft that seem to be in play would be the Legacy C models that the French Air Force retired last summer, and now there's this rumor of the Emirati aircraft. So, and like you said, Em, you were correct. It's a much more advanced variant it's a multi-role variant that the UAE flies. Brings a lot more capability. Everything is a big if, of course. We don't know if this is really happening. Nobody's outright denied on the Ukrainian or French side that this is happening. That if you actually look at what they've said, and but I believe that from the statements that I've heard, that something is in the works, and it is in its especially in its more advanced variants. It's an equivalent to an F-16. That's not to say that we shouldn't the Western world shouldn't be trying to provide F-16s to Ukraine, but it is a direct equivalent. And since this procurement process is political, involving a coalition of countries, and Ukrainian officials did say about a month ago that it looks like 2 or 3 aircraft types that will be coming to them from the West. Guaranteed one of those is F-16s. Mirage 2000 might well be the other one. And ideally you would want to have a standardized fleet, but because of the political element of it, that's not going to happen. There's probably going to be more than one type.
All right, thank you so much for that.
Oh, just a quick note. And maybe you've heard some of this. Egypt might actually play into this, because if you look at the operators of Mirage 2000 around the world, now Egypt had expressed some interest in those aircraft from the Emirates. I'm not sure where that stands. The French procurement for Ukraine, the number that's being thrown around is 40, and the UAE has probably over 60 airframes that they want to get rid of. And by the way, the UAE did place a massive order for Rafale. That's how this whole thing is happening. But Egypt as well has Mirage 2000s, and they are also a Rafale customer. So purely speculation on my point of view, from my point of view, but it could. I would not be surprised if something were to happen on that front, where they could maybe give up some of their 2000s, or maybe even the entire fleet, the Egyptians, in return for purchasing more Rafales. But that is purely speculative on my part.
So in August 2021, the Egyptian Air Force made a decision that they will not be purchasing any more Mirage 2000s in any variants. And then in December 2021, the United Arab Emirates started negotiations to sell their Mirages to Egypt and Morocco. I cannot really comment for several reasons on the status of negotiations, but in various roles throughout the Egyptian Air Force, placed an order for